Okay, so this video is gonna look at cell theory, Louis Pasteur and his disproving or proving spontaneous generation wrong, and just a brief talk about specialized cells. So, cell theory, the three ones really which we got from the Hidden Kingdom is this idea that all living things are made of cells. Okay, so the idea here is the definition of living is it contains cells. Kind of Louis Pasteur, and kind of a big idea here is the idea that all cells come from pre-existing cells. So you have a cell, it divides into two, and so forth. Okay, this doesn't really explain where the first cell came from. At some point there had to be a cell, but we can also kind of rework this as a simple idea that at the moment new cells aren't spontaneously being generated, but at some point the first cell kind of had to exist. And the other one is cells are the smallest unit of life. Okay, so anything below that, for example, we talked a little bit about viruses. By this definition, they aren't living; they're not cells. Okay, so these are kind of the more traditional definitions, and the more modern one has added a few other ones. So the idea that all cells contain hereditary information, all cells are basically the same chemical composition, and similar metabolism and biochemistry. So this idea really came in with the discovery of DNA. Okay, so this is why you look like your mom and your father, or you're similar to your sister or your brother, simply because you share the same DNA, which controls the characteristics. Right, and then the other one is basically the same composition. So the idea here is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen are the big atoms here. And if we basically divided ourselves into piles with these, and all living things would have these. And plus there's others which we'll talk about later. The final one is the idea of energy flow and metabolism. So here, basically what we're saying is certain chemical reactions happen the same in many cells. There's a lot of relationships. So the idea here is like cell respiration. So all plants and animals have a very similar cell respiration process. Photosynthesis looks very similar in these processes also. Okay, so that's kind of what that idea is getting after. And then we did talk a little bit about exceptions to cell theories. So the idea of muscle cells are an exception because they have big cells that have multiple nuclei. Okay, so they and you see this also in some fungi. The same idea is they have multiple cells. Other ones, the cells are large. Okay, so that's another idea of that. I know that's a pretty quick explanation, but there's not much more to there. But these ideas are the exceptions, right? So exceptions would be muscle cells, right? Because they have multiple nuclei. Oops, sorry, I spelled that wrong. But you get the idea. And some fungi have the same thing. So the idea of multiple nuclei. And some cells are really large cells. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. It comes up as a question sometimes. Now, this idea of Louis Pasteur kind of helped bring evidence to this first one, the fact that all living things are made from cells, and more particularly the idea of pre-existing cells. So the idea of spontaneous generation was if you put some broth out here, right? Broth was like a medium that bacteria could grow in. You left it open to the elements, you come back, and after a few days this would turn cloudy, right? So the idea is it's cloudy with bacteria. Okay? And then here, so the idea here was supporters of spontaneous generation would say that, because you had some air here, that's what allowed life to just pop up here. Okay. Louis Pasteur didn't believe this for a moment, so he built what we called a Swan neck flask. This was his experiment. Okay, and what he did was he basically created this situation, had the broth, and what happened was, in this situation, comparing both of these, this stayed clear. Okay, and what happened was the bacteria was trapped here, so it never got into the broth. So what he suggested then was bacteria from the air was making its way into this broth quite easily, but when it tried to get in here, it got trapped here. Okay, so that broth never turned, and that disproved this idea of spontaneous generation. Okay, kind of the final thing, and we just briefly touched on this. It's something we'll go into detail more later, but it was this idea of specialized cells. So in multicellular organisms, cells are specialized. Okay, so here's some examples, right? Here's two from plants, and here's two from humans, for example. And the idea here is the structure determines the function. Okay, so for example, here we have these little microvilli. Okay, and they make up what we call stereocilia, and these structures are what detects hearing. So this is how you hear it. And then what happens is these little hairs wiggle, and that's turned into a sound. So you can see how the structure of these tiny little hairs result in the function. Sperm cell, again, this is a pretty easy, straightforward one, right? You got a head, and you have a long tail. And the thing's built to swim. It allows for quick movement so that it can get to the egg. The palisade mesophyll, has high concentrations of chloroplasts, clear cell wall. That's because you find this layer of cells on the top of a leaf. Okay, and again, the top of the leaf's where most of the sunlight is going to hit, so it makes sense to have lots of chloroplasts so you can do photosynthesis. Okay, so again, that idea of structure, chloroplasts, a clear cell wall so light can go through because photosynthesis occurs there. The xylem, if you look at them in kind of more detail, there are these big long tubes that go from the roots to the leaves, and they have big dead hollow tubes, and that allows water to go up to that. So the function of these tubes is basically they're pipes, right? So just start to get your head around this idea at this point, really, about the structure of something and it matches its function. It's a key theme in biology. It's one of the bases of what we build our knowledge of biology off of. So I just wanted to introduce that here since we're talking about cells, and we'll start talking about more specialized cells later. Okay? All right, thank you.